Please, could you introduce yourself? Who are you and what do you do?
I'm Danny Fitzpatrick. I'm a lecturer in politics and international relations at Aston University. Most of my research is on the kind of politics, suppose like the political sociology of sport, mainly football. So a teacher, politics and sport module, final year module at Aston. And my background, kind of how I got into researching this area. I was originally, so I did my PhD on governance and policy around public utilities, so things like telecommunications, gas, electricity, that kind of stuff. And I specifically looked at how those industries are regulated post-privatisation and the similarities and differences to when they were nationalised. And then I started to think more about regulation of other areas of social and economic life. And I've always been a football fan. And one of the things I noticed and read a little bit about was how football, despite all its supposed problems, wasn't regulated. So I was interested in kind of why it wasn't regulated, the history of what is the self-governance of football. And I ended up writing a book, and there was a chapter on that subject, the regulation or the lack of the regulation of football. And that's kind of, I'm not sure if you know, but we're kind of, in the next 12 months, there's due to be a new independent regulator of football. So that is a development that I've kind of tracked over a number of years. And I'm interested in other things around football. One of the things I'm interested in actually is activism amongst fans. So I actually did some research with a colleague, which we're just starting to write up on the ticket price protests and activism this season. I'm interested in, I suppose, how football has changed, the role of government, and the response of fans. As well as, I suppose, a bit about me. I'm also a football supporter. So I support Everton, season ticket holder. So yeah, kind of, I've got a research interest in it, but obviously a personal interest as well. Yeah, that's roughly kind of about me. You can ask anything else if you want as well.
Perfect. Right, so you went into both questions, which is great. But how did your academic background, politics, how did your background shape your views? Do you think if you hadn't studied politics and stuff like that, you wouldn't really be bothered about what happens in sport?
That's a good question. The commercialisation of football, I suppose the honest answer is I was less aware of it when I was younger. It's really hard to answer that, to kind of separate those two things out. Trying to kind of go back in time and kind of think about that, about my perspective. It's a good question. But if you want me an honest answer, I was generally against or skeptical of some of the commercial changes. And I'm speaking as an Everton supporter here, not even as a general football fan or an academic. But I think my position as an Everton supporter was, even though Everton were one of the architects of the Premier League and everything else, we didn't do too well out of it. So we were one of the losers of that big change. So there was a general disposition that, modern football, I'm talking about modern football as, kind of into the late 90s into the 2000s, don't really it's not really for me, or I prefer, it would be better. It was better, how it used to be. But that is caused by my perspective as an Everton supporter. But it really seemed to shift. So the other thing which influenced me was the much less prevalent now. United had a couple of really big ones, and one, the likes of United, we stand. Like fanzines were a massive influence on me growing up. So more than anything else, that shaped reading the fanzines, reading the kind of editorial in the fanzine, reading fan articles. That really shaped how I thought about football and kind of gave me an insight into how other fans think about football way before I started reading any academic texts on it. So this is, more than a decade before. So I think that was probably the biggest influence. And generally, I think, inculcated, kind of shaped how I thought about Sky or the Premier League. And then obviously a bit later on, I started to read more critical pieces, maybe journalism pieces, and then started to read a little bit more of the academic work. But that was probably that would have been just over 10 years ago, so maybe from about 2012 onwards. So it didn't initially shape my views on the commercialization of football massively. I think, and actually thinking about it as I've said it, a lot of the kind of the best writing, in some ways, the most perceptive was that stuff in the fanzine that was kind of almost 20 years before. So I think in some ways the kind of academic research has kind of caught up a little bit. And there is a lag, and there's a real lack of, it's changed a little bit, but there's still a lack of academic research. Football's not really seen as that important in academia. So there's not a huge amount of it either, but it has improved certainly in the last 5 to 10 years. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's perfect. In your view, what are the main political or economic drivers behind the rising cost of football for fans?
The owners. So obviously football has commercialized itself, commodified itself, whatever you want to call it. And the number one rule of capitalism, if you kind of call football as a capitalist business, which it is in most parts, or at least for some people, capitalism needs to grow. It always needs to grow. So football is in a situation now where it can't stand still, or there's a feeling that it can't stand still. So if you are employed, if you are employed to the commercial departments at Manchester United, what's your whole job based on? How do you grow the commercial revenue of Manchester United? You can't go in and say, oh, well, we've decided to, whatever it may be, we're going to have two, we're going to have a home, we're going to go back to home and away kit. And actually all our fan surveys, so this is really popular. That won't fly because you're going to make less revenue. So the modus operandi, the whole purpose for most football clubs has shifted to growing markets, identifying new markets, making more money. For a while, that was done to support and invest in the sport and success, the team, the facilities, the academy. I think not at every club, but I think for lots of clubs, that's it. That is switched. It's what does the sporting arm of the club? What does the playing staff? How do they further the commercial revenue? So I think more than anything else, it's been an incremental cultural change within clubs and within football. That means even though we don't need necessarily, if you look at on a balance sheet, ticket prices, they are a small, almost nominal part of revenue. How do you justify that? If you're an organization which seeks to make money, if you can make more money, then there's no justification to not do it. So I wouldn't say it's a political one. It's an economic stroke, but not even economic. I think it's a cultural one. I think it's just a cultural shift in the mindset of the owners, most of the staff, and the clubs as organizations. The culture of the organization has changed. So there used to be, for the most part, ticket pricing strategies were based. They were pretty kind of informal ones, but they were based on a kind of patronage model. How do if you are thinking about the benefit to the team, then what's your key priority? Your key priority is to make sure the stadium's full, because that's of some benefit to the team. If it shifts to making revenue, then that's a completely different model. What matters to the team, whether that's atmosphere, a full stadia, that's all secondary to how much money is made through the selling of those tickets. So it doesn't matter who's in there, on what basis they're in there, and what frequency in there. As long as they're paying more money, that's all that matters. So, obviously the influx of American owners from a different sporting culture with different business strategies. We don't need to be the most astute commentator or researcher to realize that has had an impact. It's a different sporting culture, and you can see its evidence. What they want to do is minimize risk, sporting risk, and maximize revenue. That seems to be it. So I would say it's not a political one. It's not really an economic one. It's more of a cultural one as much as anything else. The culture of English football has changed, and I think that's the main reason why the cost of football is rising. All the stuff about PSR, it's all a smokescreen largely. Maybe apart from a couple of clubs, but even the clubs that have mainly been affected by PSR are the ones where actually the costs have not risen sharply as others. So yeah, I think that's a load of rubbish, really.
Well, speaking on the rising costs, do you still think football's accessible for anyone, or is it only becoming accessible for people that can afford it, do you think?
Depends what you mean by accessibility. So that I think that's the change to the Premier League, sort of obviously a massive increase in the cost of tickets initially, for even at that point in 1992. To a certain extent, that did price out some fans. And of course, there might have always been a small proportion of fans who couldn't afford to go to football. The fact is, you have to pay money to go to football, so it's never been completely accessible to everyone. But obviously, you're narrowing the band of people within society who can go. So the difference is what we mean, I think, by affordability and accessibility. So someone might be, let's say, someone in an average salary who's got 3 kids might say, well, I can afford to take my 3 kids to 1 game a season. And you might get a Premier League chairman or owner or chief executive go, well, there you go, football's accessible, they can take them to 1 game. But that's not the culture of English football. The culture of English football is that you go to multiple games or most home games. That accessibility for most, and again, depends on what you define as working class, but most working people has gone, I would say. At the Premier League level for most clubs, probably a lot of Championship clubs, and obviously you've got the wider cost of living crisis, so there's other factors which affect that accessibility. What I think things in the last year or two have moved on from then. So I think all the way through the Premier League period, fans have accepted a situation where they thought the costs are rising, it's becoming more and more difficult for me to afford it. And some fans have just been priced out. I think other fans have thought, this is more difficult for me, but I'll make it a priority, or I'll make adjustments. So I'll buy 2 season tickets, and my son or daughters or whoever it is will share that, or friends will share them. They'll have made adjustments and have kind of tolerated it. Now I think what some clubs are doing is to strategically pricing fans out, or not even pricing them out, just by other measures, excluding them because they don't want them. So I think one of the bigger things is you're seeing the link being broken of how people become fans of a club. So the pathways to becoming a fan. Virtually everyone who is a fan, supporter of a club, is generally, not always, but is generally taken to a game by someone else, whether it's a family member, a parent, an older sibling, a family friend, whoever it is, someone who gets them into being a supporter at some point, relatively in their, childhood or young adulthood. I think that it's that link that's being broken now. The big thing in the Premier League era that was sold to fans, or was sold as like one of the things, is that football before the Premier League era, with some violence and disorder, put people off or excluded certain people. It was dominated by a young male demographic. What we want to make football is family friendly and for the family. And it actually sold itself on the basis of buy a season ticket and buy a kid's season ticket, and we'll make that kid's season ticket at a concessionary price, because they thought, well, that's a future fan who will bring their children. That has changed. Clubs don't want that anymore. At least at the top of the Premier League, they don't want families to come. But they're not interested, at least, in offering them a concession. What they want is just to maximise whoever they can get in who's going to spend the most money on that day. So I think the story of the Premier League is about it becoming less affordable, but now is different, where I think some clubs are deliberately making it inaccessible in lots of different ways, not just through price. But the things I've got a friend who's a City fan, and they've said that thing: if you don't go to 14 games, a minimum of 40, you lose your season ticket revoked, it's gone. So all these things are coming in where, when a season ticket, when someone passes away, the season ticket's not sold back on, it's kept by the club. So all these things are indicative of clubs deliberately excluding a certain group of fans. And I think it's massively, massively short-sighted. I think the clubs overestimate the loyalty is the wrong word, but they overestimate how strong the habit of going to matches. I've spoken to loads of people in my research who are ardent fans who've gone for decades and decades and decades, and they said sometimes you just get to a certain point and you stop going, and once you stop going for a month or 2 months, you just lose the habit and it stops. So I think clubs underestimate they might just say, well, it's just this global demand and it's limitless, and they might be right, but there will be a fundamental impact, I think, on the nature of the support, definitely.
Moving on, so the point you made about them maximising profit, do you think the government or regulators should play more active role in controlling stuff like that in football?
Yeah, I do. As I say, I've looked at other regulators, and the number one job for most regulators, if you look at regulators of public utilities, is price. That's what first and foremost, they regulate the price. So, Ofgem, the energy regulator, you might have heard, has an energy price cap that was brought in kind of around the pandemic, and obviously the huge inflation in energy prices. So I think it's a slight cop out, because the football governance bill says it put fans at the heart of the regime, but if fans are excluded or priced out, then the most important thing we can talk about, obviously, stadia are really important as heritage assets. Other things which the regulator is going to protect, like the colour of the club shirt and the badge, they're all really, really important. But if people can't go to the match, what's the point? That's what matters. That's what matters as a fan, that you can afford to go and watch your team. So if that goes, then everything else is kind of it's secondary to me. So I think the broadcasting fee maybe is slightly different. So by broadcasting fees, do you mean the money paid for subscriptions, or do you mean the money paid for club?
Both kind of, because they're all just rising, really, aren't they?
Yeah, I see that as it's a good question. For me, the ticket price is fundamental, and I've got no issue with saying one of the difficult things with any research of fans is who is a fan and what parameters you put on it, and are some fans more important than others. Speaking as a supporter now rather than a researcher, I think match-going fans have been dealt a raw deal in lots of different ways, and they need to be protected and almost privileged by this new regulatory regime. So, things like broadcasting times is a case in point where the TV viewer, whether that's the domestic TV viewer or the overseas TV viewer, their interests are privileged over fans who travel home and away to go and watch the match. So I would like to see that redressed. In terms of broadcasting fees, I'd probably like to see the regulator play a role in protecting particularly the FA Cup and the terrestrial coverage of that. As regards, let's say, Sky or Amazon, I'm less concerned about that. I think that's a job for Ofcom as the communications regulator. That is a market. So, I don't have Sky, but if I had Sky and they hike me price up, then that's their commercial decision, and I make a consumer decision about whether I'm willing to pay that or not. So I'm a bit more comfortable with that being outside the regulatory scope. I think the important thing for the regulator is to preserve or to protect rather than preserve the kind of the match day experience for fans. That's what I would be most important. I put most importance on.
One final question, if that's all right with you. If current pricing trends continue, what do you think football will look like in 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, I think it goes back to me kind of earlier point about the intergenerational aspect of football. So I am worried if things continue, football or some football clubs will lose that, and the role of football clubs as part of the community, as an anchor point for a place, I think, which are really, really important and more important than ever, that will kind of almost fall away. I went to Goodison on Saturday. Obviously, there's one more game, but it was the last Saturday, 3:00 on Saturday, and I could see people when I was leaving that was going to be their last game, and people are sitting there remembering, and they remember people they sat with who they've lost, and all those kind of personal and collective memories rely on people going to the match together, being able to afford to go, but also being able to sit together. You know, I've got lots of friends who are Liverpool supporters, and obviously their tickets are a bit more than us, but the demand is a bit greater. The nature of their crowd is different, is much more global. All the friends I speak to are Liverpool fans. None of them sit together because they can't sit together. None of them. They all go to the match on their own. So that communal, collective aspect of going with people, going with your family, or going together, I think in 10 years, if it continues as it is, that will just go. It will just completely evaporate. People may go, but they'll go on their own, and they'll go in the match and they'll go home, and that'll be it. And something, you know, football is a kind of a sociable activity. It should be, and I think that will be lost, and I think it will be difficult to get it back. And I do think that will have some wider kind of ramifications for just how we see it and football's role in it within kind of national culture. I just don't think the club owners don't care. But the thing which is unique about English football is the pyramid, and it's the depth of that and that strength of community feeling that runs throughout that pyramid. That is like so important, and that also. So I think that community aspect lost, and potentially the football pyramid might go. It might be completely different. So yeah, I think they could be unfortunate and likely outcomes if things carry on as they are.
Thank you very much for your time. That was perfect.
No worries, Edson. Good to chat to you.